Many of you might be wondering what this lovely case is. Little old, smells old. It is fairly old. And I'll tell you a little bit of background is when we were growing up, one of our favorite things of all time was Lego. My brothers and I, four boys all together, we loved Lego. And for years and years and years, for Christmas and birthdays, all we asked for was Lego. And I love putting it together. In fact, we have boxes and boxes in our basement. None of my brothers wanted it for some reason. Thousands of dollars worth of Lego in our basement sitting there. Naomi wasn't sure if she wanted it at first, but I've convinced her. Well, this here are all the instruction manuals for all the Lego that we have. But why in such an old, ratty, dirty case? Well, when you're an 8-year-old boy and you open up your Lego box on Christmas Day and you pour all the pieces out, the most intimidating thing is step one, because you look on the front of the box and you see what's on the front of the box, and it looks so awesome. The castle, the pirate ship, the Star Wars whatever thing, Millennium Falcon or something along those lines. And it looks so great, and you open up to step one, and you get the two smallest pieces and put them together. And there's about 200 steps left to go. And you think, I am never going to get this thing finished. Why can't it just be complete in about 1 or 2 steps? Why this? And so what happens is once you eventually get it finished, a week later it gets destroyed, you put the instruction booklet into here because you know what you never use it ever again? The instruction booklet. Because all of the pieces go into the boxes and boxes, and you make whatever you want. But for me as an 8-year-old boy, I wanted step 1 to be, open up package, and by step 3 it be complete, right? And that's what I wanted as an 8-year-old boy. And what I found in my life is I want God to be the same way for me, as I want God to be like, okay, you know what? In your life, you're going to have steps, and here's this great big promise. We talked about standing on God's promises. And I want step 1 to be start following, and the very next step, the very next day, here's the promise complete and everything's good to go. That's what I want. And what happens is there's the nation of Israel kind of want the same thing. They don't want to follow about 63 different steps until they get to the finished product. They want the finished product now. I want the finished product now. But do you ever find that God doesn't give us that finished product right now? That there's some different steps that we have to take to get there? And you know what I find about the steps? Sometimes I don't like the steps. In fact, the final step in any Lego construction piece is usually really, really easy. It's like one last piece to put on. It's super easy. Some of the steps in between could be a little difficult, especially when you got into some of the more advanced Lego. And I didn't like those in-between steps. And I wish I could just skip them. And I'd call my mom or my dad down to help me with it. And so I just want to skip those steps. And I find that's what I want to do with God. I just want to skip some of the steps that he has for me in life. I just want to get over them. Nation of Israel, they just want to get over the steps that God has for them. They want to get to the promised land. But God isn't taking them right to the promised land. Why? Why doesn't God just give it to them? Why doesn't God just take them, boop, transport right to the promised land? Why doesn't he do that? Well, open up with me to Exodus chapter 15. We're going to see why does God have all these steps for Israel? Why doesn't God just provide for them? Why doesn't he give them everything they need and take them right to the promised land? Why doesn't God do that for us? Why doesn't God just, bam, here it is, all right there, out in front of you, take it, you're good to go. Exodus chapter 15. Exodus 15. And what we see in Exodus 15 is that the Israelites have just crossed the Red Sea, and they have this amazing worship service that is going on, where Moses leads in some singing, and then Miriam leads the women out in singing, and in verse 21, it says, Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea." And they have this amazing time on the other side of the Red Sea, worshiping and praising God because he has triumphed gloriously over Egypt, and he has delivered them from the hand of Pharaoh. But the problem is they aren't in the promised land. That side of the Red Sea, it's just not like, bam, across the Red Sea, we're in the promised land. They have a little ways to go. And so we see in verse 22, Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. It's a little bit of an issue. I don't understand it really well because growing up in Canada for most of my life, like if you go camping, what is there abundance of if you go camping in Northern Ontario? Water. Like if you hike about 100 yards in any direction when you're in Northern Ontario, you're coming across a pond, a stream, a lake, something. You're coming across some sort of water. So you never have that worry of running out of water. And in the wilderness, there's no water, which usually means that there's basically no plants. There's no life in general. There's nothing in the wilderness. And I know growing up as a kid, I could never really figure out why could they not find water for 3 days? Like, what's the deal here? Well, they're in a desert. There's no water in a desert. And so they can't find water. But then they come across Marah in verse 23. And can you imagine they come to Marah and word goes through the camp, we found water. Now, when you're really thirsty and you know that there's water there, you get pretty excited about that water. And so the word would go through camp, we found water, we found water, we found water. But then the word would come through the camp. But they could not drink it because the water was bitter, and therefore it was named Marah, which means bitter. And the water is bitter, they cannot drink it, and so what do the people of Israel become? They become bitter. They become a little bitter. And they complain against Moses and say, what are we going to drink? And God says to Moses, all right, take this log here, throw it in the water, and he throws it in the water, and what happens to the water? It becomes sweet, and they're able to drink it. And God says, if you follow my word, everything's going to be great. And don't worry, I'm not going to bring the plagues that I brought on Egypt. It says in verse 26, if you diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, and give ears to his commandments, and keep his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord, your healer. And then he takes them to this beautiful place called Elim. Not Elim Lodge, Elim. And they camp at Elim where there's 12 springs, one for each of the tribes of Israel. And there's 70 palm trees, one for each of the elders of Israel. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that really nice? Isn't that like a nice oasis? It's like their vacation in the middle of the wilderness. You know what I want to know? Why did God take them to Marah first? Seriously. Like Elam was less than a day away from Marah. Why would God take them to Marah first and not just right to Elam? I'd be pretty upset if I was the Israelites because I'm following God by a cloud or by fire, and I'm following him. And I'm trusting that God knows where he's going. And he takes us to this bitter place where we get excited and then depressed because we can't drink it, and then he heals the water. Why didn't he just, instead of going here and then over there, do Pythagorean theorem and go straight across this way? Why wouldn't God do that? And so they continue on from Elim. They continue on from there. Oh, I go back. This is a question Naomi and I had a couple years ago, because Naomi was finishing up school, and she was doing a placement at Cameco. And it was a great placement. She really enjoyed it, really enjoyed the work. And she found out towards the end of her placement that there was someone who was retiring, and a job position was going to open up in that department. And we thought, this is going to be good. Cameco's a good place to work, good pay, great benefits. Naomi's the shoe-in. She's been the placement here. She knows it better than anyone else who would be there. Obviously, she's going to get the job. And she didn't get the job. I remember driving home one day, and she's saying she got the phone call that she didn't get the job. And she was pretty upset because she thought, like, what was wrong with her? Like, she did they not? They said she did a great job. What happened? And what happened was neat. A couple months later, is a job position opened at TCS, Trinity College School in Port Hope. And it wasn't it wasn't what Naomi had gone to school for. It was in admissions. And there was 30 other applicants. Naomi was one of the only ones without experience. And you know what happened? She got the job. And we sat there and were baffled. Why, when Naomi is the ideal candidate, does she not get the job? And now she gets the job. And we thank God, and we are so blessed. But God, why wouldn't you just not let the Cameco job happen and just let us get the TCS job? Really, why aren't you doing this for us? It's nice, but couldn't we have skipped that step in between? And so they even though they would like to stay at Elim, any of us would, they break out from Elim, and the congregation of people in chapter 16 head into the wilderness of Sin. And like I said, there's a couple things that aren't in the wilderness, aren't in the desert. You don't have water, and because you don't have water, you don't have much vegetation, and you don't have many animals, so you don't have any food. And so what we see in verse 2, the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." You know what they said right there? We would rather be serving Pharaoh right now as slaves than following God in the wilderness. We would rather be serving Pharaoh as slaves than following God in the wilderness. And they look back and they think, it was great back then. Have you ever thought that sometimes? Sometimes our picture of maybe what our friends are living their life without God is like, and they're doing really well, and since coming to God and following God, things aren't going so well, and we kind of think, you know what? Things were a little bit nicer back then, forgetting actually how bad things were back then. They say that happens to mothers, apparently, when they get a little older with their kids. Is you have babies, and you have a rough first 3 months. And apparently they say that mothers forget how bad those first 3 months are, and that's why after a couple of years they want to have a second baby. It's something, I think Egypt or Israel forgot how bad it actually was in Egypt, and right in the middle of the wilderness, right when they feel that they don't have enough meat, they complain and they grumble and said, we would rather be serving Pharaoh. What's funny about this is, as we'll see in a little bit, in chapter 17, they complain because they don't have enough water for their livestock. Apparently they don't have food, but a chapter later, they don't have enough water for their livestock. They weren't starving. I think it was just that they wanted more than what they had right then and there, that they wanted as much as they could possibly eat, and they didn't like this idea of marching through the wilderness and having to ration what they ate as they marched through the desert. And so Moses goes to God, and God says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you guys some food. And what I'm going to do is the dew's going to fall, and when the dew rises, there's going to be the substance on the ground. And each morning, you're to go out, and you're to collect what is on the ground. And the Israelites called it manna, which is, what is it? They didn't know what it was, because there wasn't anything exactly. It was basically like bread. And so they go out, and they're told to collect how much? Collect enough just for you and your family for that day and no more. But you do that 5 days a week. On the sixth day, you go out and you collect twice as much. You collect double. Because I don't want you to go out on the seventh day and collect. You're going to have a rest on the seventh day. You aren't going to go out and collect. How many of you think that's pretty simple instructions? Think you can follow those instructions, right? So I bet if I gave you a quiz right now, you could tell me 5 days, collect as much for that one day. Sixth day, collect twice as much. So for the 6 days, I think we'd all get it, right? And so what happens is in verse 19 of chapter 16, Moses said to them, "Let no one leave any of it over till the morning." But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. How did they miss the instructions? How did they miss collect only as much as you're going to eat that day? Don't collect any more. Don't let it sit till morning. How did they miss that? And then they continue on in verse 27. On the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? How do they not get it? It's simple commandments. You guys all know it right now. We could teach a bunch of 5-year-olds how to follow these commands. Why didn't they get it? How come they didn't understand? It's so simple. Don't they know it? And as I was reading this, I thought, Ben, don't you know that you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself? Didn't you memorize that when you were a little kid? You do that every day? Ben, thou shalt not lie. One of the first commandments your parents probably tell you. Do you do that every day? Ben, love your enemy as yourself. How hard is that to remember? Love your enemy as yourself. And all of these commands that I've been taught, all these commands by God that I've been taught over and over again, I remember them. I know them. I can tell you them inside and out. And yet I continue to not do them. Do you find the same in your life? You know God's commands inside and out? And I always wonder, what's the deal? Why do I continue to not do them? And as I read this, I realized they didn't do, it wasn't because they didn't know it. It's because they didn't trust God in it. Because if they trust that the first day it comes out, food! Yeah! I love food! Go collect it all. And what are you going to do if you're running out of food? You're going to collect it all and put it all in your storage bins and take it with you, right? And it goes rotten. Okay, so we've learned our lesson. So on the 6th day, you know what? I'm not so sure God knows what he's talking about. So definitely on the 6th day, we aren't going to collect twice as much because I don't want it to go rotten again. And so a bunch of them don't collect twice as much because they don't want it to go rotten again. They've learned their lesson. And then they go out on the 7th day, food! Where's the food? Where'd it go? Where's the manna? What happened to it? They didn't trust God. They didn't trust what he had said. It wasn't that they didn't know the commands. It wasn't that they could have memorized them backwards. It's so easy. It's that they didn't trust God. And that's what I find for myself. In love your neighbor as yourself. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love your enemies. Well, forgive others. What if my enemies just continue to treat me poorly? God, did you ever think about that? What if every time I forgive someone, they take advantage of my forgiveness? God, did you ever think about that? And I go in my head and I justify reasons why maybe I shouldn't trust God in what he said to me. Because maybe God hasn't really thought about it through. And that doesn't necessarily process in my head, but that's really what's going on there in the background of my mind. God, I don't really trust that your way, what you've outlined for me, is exactly the best way to do it. But they have to continue on. They have to keep moving. And so in chapter 17, what happens? They're moving, verse 1, all the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages. And they came to Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Once again, they're in a desert. No water to drink. What are they going to do? Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. And he said to them, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord? But the people thirsted for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Are you serious, Israel? Really? You're going to keep on complaining? You look down at verse 7. What do they call the name of the place? Massah and Meribah. Because the people quarreling with Israel and because they tested the Lord by saying, is the Lord among us or not? And here at Rephidim, what happens is God says to Moses, take your staff that you touched the Nile with and turn to blood, and go and hit the rock, and water will pour out. But don't just sort of walk over there. Take the elders with you and march in front of everybody and walk over and hit the rock, and water will pour out. What I find amazing about this is Moses takes the staff that brought death to Egypt and walks over to a rock, and God uses that same staff to bring life to Israel, to give them that water. But let's go back to the name of the place that they called it. Is the Lord among us or not? Is the Lord among us or not? How stupid is Israel? Do you not read this and think, like, how dumb is the nation of Israel? God brought 10 plagues on Egypt. He parted a Red Sea. He gave them sweet water. He took them to Elam. He gave them manna every day for 40 years. He filled their camp with quail that first night. Is God among us or not? Those things look pretty God-like to me, like God of the universe performing mighty acts and doing all this. Is God among us or not? Do they not get it? Do they not understand? This week, as I was reading this, God knocked on my head, and He said to me, you know those tough times that you have when you ask the question sometimes, God, where are you? God, what are you doing? And you guys, we have those tough days, right? And He said, you know the tough days when you wake up in your warm bed in your house, and you get up and you turn on your hot coffee, and you eat breakfast with your wife and your son sitting there, and you hop in one of your two cars, and you go to work, a work that you enjoy doing, and then you come home and you eat supper, and you go to bed in your nice warm bed. The tough days where you're asking where I am, and you see me over and over and over and over again. And I come down so hard on Israel when I read this, and yet I think, that's totally me on those tough days. When I say, where is God? And I miss out all sorts of things that God is doing in my life because all I can focus on is one thing. And the people of Israel, they're thirsty. All they can focus on right then is their thirst. And they say, where is God? What's He doing? And they totally forget about all the other blessings that God is doing in their life and all the other ways that He's providing for them. In fact, He's even taking them to this amazing promised land, a whole land for themselves. And they forget. And I think, I'm the exact same way. I forget. I do that exact same thing. And they continue on from Rephidim. And Amalek, and we see in verse 8, Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out to fight with Amalek. And tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And so Joshua, which before this, you've never heard of Joshua. This is the first time Joshua appears on the scene. And Joshua is going to lead the people of Israel into battle against Amalek. And Moses has this great military plan. Really, really going to work well. Stand up on top of the hill. I'm going to hold my staff like this. Right? It's good. You know, that's good military thinking right there. If I stand on the hill and I hold my staff like this, we are going to win, Joshua. Don't worry about it. If I was Joshua, I'd be like, how about I stand on the hill and hold the staff and you go down and fight? Right? You can imagine Joshua, right? And Moses goes up and he takes two men with him, Aaron and Hur, and he stands up on the hill and he holds his staff up. And as long as his staff is held up like this, then they win. But his arms get tired and his arms start to drop. And when his arms drop, the Amalekites win. And so the two guys with him get a rock. Quick, we need to fix this. Grab a rock. Because this may seem insane, but this hand thing is actually really working. Grab a rock. Moses, sit down on the rock. Put your hands up. We're going to hold your hands up for you. And they do that, and Moses' hands with the staff above his head are held up, and they win the battle, and they defeat the Amalekites. Now, it doesn't say in this passage anywhere, God told Moses to go do this. But doesn't this have God's fingerprints all written all over it? Some ridiculous military plan, go stand and put your staff up in the air, right? Totally, I look at that and say, that is totally Israel getting it. Didn't have to put in there that, God had gone and told them to do this. That Moses understood, Israel understood, and they realized, all right, some of these ridiculous things God has been telling us to do, they actually kind of work. Throw a log into water, go out and collect the stuff on the ground, strike the rock with a stick and let water pour out. You know what? Can you imagine the soldiers? They're heading headlong into battle, saying, we're going to fight Amalek. And all that Moses is telling them is, as long as I hold my staff up, we're going to win. They finally get it. They finally learn. And so, I ask the question once again, though, why didn't God just provide for them? Later in the Bible, we read a widow of Zarephath, and she goes, and every time she opens up her oil and flour, it's always full. There's always oil and flour there. Why didn't God just give them unlimited water and unlimited food in their store, and as they walked along? Why didn't God just do that? Or like I said earlier, why didn't God just transport them to the Promised Land? Why didn't God just wipe out Amalek and all of his army? Why didn't God bring some water from the Red Sea in a huge wave coming across and sweep off Amalek like he did with Pharaoh? Why didn't God do that? Turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Says this, starting in verse 1. The whole commandment that I command to you today you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Why? That he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing out in the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley and of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive trees and honey, a land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing, a land whose stones are iron, and out of those hills you can dig copper. And you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. In the Exodus story we were reading, they're about to get to Mount Sinai, and God is about to give them the law, the Torah. And he wants to know, will Israel trust his word? Will Israel trust his commandments, his instructions? And so it says here in Deuteronomy 8 that he as a father disciplines his son, so he disciplined them. And when I think discipline, what I think is like a good spanking, right? Is that what you think when you? That's what I think when I think discipline is. You need a good spanking, right? That was when I was growing up and I didn't do what I was supposed to do, which happened a lot. I got a good spanking, and that's what I think of discipline. But the key of discipline is that idea of correction. It's not the idea of pain and suffering. It's the idea of correction. So discipline, you can also say that people in art or in sports are disciplined. Or you can say to your kids, are you disciplined enough to study when you go off to college? That idea of discipline. In football, we really highlight, your offensive players score touchdowns. Your defensive players make good tackles. Your quarterbacks and your wide receivers, your running backs, middle linebackers, outside linebackers, all these people, you really highlight those people. And then they talk about unsung heroes. Well, I have, on every football team, I think there are unsung heroes that we really never hear about. When I was in high school, super important. Every single special teams was a huge thing. The kickoff, the punt were huge. And there was two guys, the contain men, and they had one job: to go down the outside of the field and to stay on the outside of the field. No matter what was happening in the middle, no matter whether or not they thought they could come in and make the tackle, they had to stay on the outside of the field. Now, why was that? Because oftentimes, and you'll watch this in football, if you watch NFL, CFL, college football, if the containment men don't stay to the outside of the field and the guy with the ball sees it, what does he do? He bounces it out the outside, and when most big returns you see are down the sidelines. They don't, the short returns end right in the middle of the field most of the time. Most of the big returns are down the outside because the containment have not stayed to the outside. And especially in high school football, you know what you want to do in high school football? You want to run down, you want to make the tackle. But we practiced and practiced and practiced, and those containment had to stay on the outside of the field. And if they didn't during practice, we did a lot of running. And so these containment, all they had to do, don't care about the ball and what's happening in the middle, focus on going down the outside. And they had to be disciplined in order to do that, because it's really tempting to go into the middle and try to be the star to make the tackle. But you look really bad if you're the one who goes in and the guy bounces to the outside and gets a touchdown, especially in a close game. And so it was during practice that the contained men learned, stay on the outside of the field. You need to be disciplined to stay on the outside of the field. Run straight down. That's exactly what God did with Israel here. God's taken them through the wilderness. God could have provided water for them. He could have provided food for them anyway. But what he wanted to know is, will they be disciplined enough to listen to what he has to say, to obey his word? Because they're getting to Mount Sinai, and it's no longer just about, some food and some water. When they're getting to Mount Sinai and they're getting his law and they're carrying on into the promised land, it's more than that. Because if they don't obey God's law, they're getting taken out of the promised land. And so God doesn't want to discipline them in the big game there. He wants to discipline them earlier on so that they learn what they need to be doing when the chips are down. Our coach didn't put special teams together on the first game and say, okay, you two guys on the outside, just run down the straight. It's really easy to do. He did it over and over and over again in practice when it didn't matter quite as much, when it wasn't the huge deal, so that in the game, when it really mattered, they would stay where they needed to stay as the containment. And so I ask us tonight, why does God take us through the steps that he takes us through in life? Why does he take us there? It's not easy, is it? In John 6, it's funny because they're talking about manna again in John 6. And Jesus has just fed the 5,000. And they come and they find Jesus again. And he says, you're only following me because I filled your stomachs. He said, I have better work for you to do. And they said, well, what is it? He's like, you just need to believe in the one that God has sent. And they said, okay, Moses gave us manna. What sign are you going to perform to prove to us that you're from God? What sign are you going to perform? He gave us manna for 40 years. And Jesus said, Moses didn't give you manna. God gave you manna. God gave you manna. And you know what? God has given you something else that has come down from heaven, a bread that has come down from heaven, that if you eat, you will never die. And they say, give it to us. Like, we want this bread. Kind of like the Israelites, like, manna, food, yeah, sweet, we want that, right? And he said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, you will never go hungry, you will never thirst again. And they're like, you're Joseph's son. You're just a carpenter. What do you mean? And he says, I tell you the truth. Everyone who ate of that manna that came from heaven died. Everyone who eats of me, the bread of life, will never die, but will have eternal life. And it's really funny because you know what the text says? And some of them started grumbling. And I'm like, man, this is like Israel. Like the people, they started grumbling. We're like, come on, seriously? And they said, and it said, some of his disciples said, this is a really hard teaching. Who can understand and follow this teaching? This is really hard. This is difficult. And after that, many of his disciples left. And I think one of the issues that we have in this world, and maybe you're sitting here tonight and you're thinking, you know what? Yeah, I'm not into this Christianity thing because I've heard about what they have to do, and that is hard stuff. I don't like that so much. I don't think that's worth it. Or maybe you're willing to ditch it and say, it has been too hard for me, and I don't like the steps that God has taken me through. In John 6, Jesus turns to the disciples, and he says to them, "Do you want to go away as well?" And Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life, and we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." What I find interesting about his response, he doesn't say, actually, this isn't that hard of a teaching. But he says, where else will we go because you have the words of eternal life? And I encourage you, if you are wondering about Christianity and you are questioning, there is nowhere else that we can go for the words of eternal life. For all of eternity, Jesus is the only one who can give us eternal life. But what about those of us who we don't have such a big issue with Christianity? Those of us who are here and we say, you know what, I've been a faithful Christian for years, and things are going great, and I love God and I love serving Him, and it's been a great 10, 20, 40, 50, 60 years, however long it's been. When I read out of Deuteronomy 8, I ended in verse 10. But there's a warning that is given to Israel in Deuteronomy 8. Verse 11 says this, "Take care, lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His rules and His statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply and your silver and gold is multiplied and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions, and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that He might humble you and test you to do good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may confirm His covenant that He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. If you forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I solemnly warn you today that you shall surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so shall you perish, because you would not obey the voice of the Lord your God." And this is the warning for us today that have served God for years and years and years, and things have gone really, really well. It's to be careful that we don't say, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. When Naomi and I wanted to go get that job at Cameco for Naomi, what was it? Naomi had done the placement. It was right. It was what she had gone for school for. She was the perfect candidate. And both of us thought, she's the one who's going to get that because of what she's done. And God doesn't give it to her. God didn't give her that job. God gave her a job where we're like, yeah, there's no way she's going to get this job. So that we would remember that it's God that gives us our wealth, that it's God who gives us that job. When I graduated from Moody, I was like, I graduated from Moody, the Moody Bible Institute. Who wouldn't want to hire me? I'm a nice guy, pretty good looking. And I started applying in January before I graduated. And I didn't end up here until almost a year later. And God had to teach me that it's not because I went to Moody, not because my dad's a pastor, it's because He's the one who provides me with what I need. For each one of us, whatever it is. So often we try to rely on our abilities and our talents that we have in this world to impress people and to prove to people how good we are, and we're going to get good grades or a good job or more money or better cars or better houses, whatever it is. And it's all from God that He gives us everything that we have. And then I think about, what about us as a church? Because every anniversary, I love our anniversary Sundays. It's great celebrating our church. Almost 70 years. And God has blessed this church from the Orange Hall right to this beautiful building that we have today. Amen? And I read this passage, and I thought, take care, and I inserted this, lest when you have a large building and great staff and a lot of people and a big budget and big programs, that you forget the Orange Hall. You forget 21% and almost not being able to pay the bills. You forget where you've been, and you say, my power and my might have gotten me this wealth. My power and might have gotten me here. And can I encourage us tonight to heed this warning? And there's nothing wrong with looking at budgets. There's nothing wrong with lots of people. There's nothing wrong with great programs. VBS is a great program. And that kid said, it's the camp where I learned about God. That's awesome, right? But my question is, do we let those become our gods that we worship? Or is it God that we are allowing to build the church? Because I find it very tempting to say, as long as we have enough people and a big enough budget and some pretty awesome programs, that's what's going to build a church, right? And you find books out there, and that's what we're going to do. Here's the right programs you're going to do, and here's the right leadership things you need to be having, and all this other stuff like that. And for me, this was a big warning. Ben, are you remembering that it's me who builds the church? Or are you just trying to do it by following these other gods? So I encourage us, Fellowship Baptist Church. Let's follow, as we taught the kids at VBS, the one true God. Satan's a tricky guy. And he knows that these things are there's things that we like to follow out there and try to seek after. And it can be tough. Lego instructions. You don't start five-year-olds off with the most intricate, huge, biggest Lego instructions. If you open up in here, there's a bunch of Lego instructions that are really small and are about 5 steps. Why are they 5 steps? Because a 5-year-old would not be able to do 53 steps. They would quit after 5. They have 5 steps. But as you grow and you learn, what you learn is that if you continue through all the steps, you get to the finished product. And you can have bigger and bigger and bigger things happen. And in my life, in the life of our church, there's been some smaller things, and they gradually get bigger, right? Where we have to trust God, and trust God, and trust God, and trust God, and watch Him do things. Where the steps might be a little longer, the steps might be a little harder, but we need to learn to trust Him. And what I wonder for us as a church family is, what's the next thing? What is the next thing that we are going to trust God for and say, you know what, God? We need you in this in a powerful way. And we're just looking to you and saying, please grow your church however you want to grow it. Because we don't want it to be about us and what we can do. We want it to be about you and what you can do. So that it's not just kids coming home from VBS and saying, hey, it was a camp where I learned about God. But the entire Northumberland region who says, I went to that church and I learned about God. Let's pray.